everyone, how are you? This is your host Habdugo for Oromia Media Network. Today we have Claire Beston, Ethiopian Eritrea Research for Amnesty International. We are going to do an interview with Claire Beston on the report that Amnesty International released, which is titled Because I'm Oromo, Sweeping Repression in Oromia region of Ethiopia. We're going to talk to Claire about that report. It seems like a very significant report. Can you talk about how you produced that report and why you focused on the Oromo?
Yeah, and first of all, as you said, it has received really good media attention, which is very positive because the first step in addressing human rights violations is documenting them and acknowledging them and having an understanding that they're happening, and also the nature of how they happen, the patterns of violations, which is what we wanted to try and document in this report. It looks specifically at the Oromo because whilst the Ethiopian government is hostile to dissent, and that's an issue that we've been working on for many years, issues of freedom of expression and the targeting of people who are opposition to the government or express dissenting opinions or in other way manifest dissenting behaviour. That happens across the country, but there are indications that it happens at a higher level in Oromia and that it's very frequently preemptive in Oromia, that people are targeted very broadly based on their political opinion, or frequently it's just based on the suspicion of their political opinion. There are indications, including anecdotal evidence, that Oromo make up a very high proportion of detainees in federal detention centres, in federal police stations and federal prisons. Oromo are the majority in Ethiopian refugee populations, and other indications that Oromo are particularly targeted at a higher level on this basis of hostility to dissent. So that's what we wanted to try and document and look at the patterns of how it happened. I, as Amnesty International's Ethiopia researcher, was quite aware of these issues, but I think more widely there wasn't a good understanding of the issues, and so that's what we wanted to have a substantial report on the issues.
Mm-hmm. So where did you do the interviews, and if you could talk about where the setting of the interviews was? Did you do it in Oromia, or where was the interview setting?
So Amnesty International hasn't had access to Ethiopia since 2011, when we were expelled from the country on our last visit. For that reason, the majority of the interviews for this report, and there were about 240 testimonies that went into the report, were collected in refugee situations. So the majority were done in Kakuma refugee camp, in Nairobi in Kenya, in Hargeisa in Somaliland, and Kampala in Uganda, and then some other individual cases in different countries around the world. About 50 of those testimonies were people within Ethiopia, most of which were done over the phone and occasionally on email, and some were in that last visit in 2011 before we were expelled, because the time frame of the report is from we started at the large sweeping arrest that happened in early 2011 as the beginning of the time frame up until now. So there were some interviews from 2011 inside the country that also went into this report.
So as you already pointed out, there is a restriction on the research and reporting of Amnesty International and also other human rights organizations in Ethiopia and in Oromia since 2001 or even prior to that. You pointed out in the report that between 2011 and 2014, about 5,000 people of Oromo origin were detained. So that is big. Given the restrictions, what's the challenge of getting really? This seems to be like the iceberg of the situation there. What is your main concern in terms of getting information out of Oromia, out of Ethiopia about the massive human rights abuses in this region?
Yeah, well, it's a very important point. And the figure of 5,000 were cases that we could confirm and confidently say that was the minimum number that there were 5,000 cases of arrest based on political opinion or often on the suspicion of someone's political opinion between 2011 and 2014. There are certainly more cases. That is not a comprehensive number, that's just the number that we know of. And the reason why there are certainly more is, as you say, that there are immense challenges because civil society, human rights civil society within Ethiopia has been totally destroyed by the government. There's almost no independent media, particularly in Oromia. There's very little independent reporting, and human rights violations are not being documented in Ethiopia. They're happening all over the country in different contexts. They're not being reported, and there's what that adds up to as well is an environment of total impunity. So there's no accountability for the people who are perpetrating these violations, including the security services, the police and the military. And many of the violations documented in this report are being perpetrated by the federal police, the local police, the federal military, as well as other actors. And there's no accountability for that. There's nowhere for victims of violations and family members of victims to go to try and seek justice, to try and seek answers, to try and seek redress or compensation. So it is really challenging, and also part of that environment is that people who talk to human rights organisations, whether international or activists within the country, people who talk to the media are at risk of being arrested, and people have been arrested for talking to Amnesty International, as you may know. Bekele Gerba and Olbana Lelisa in 2011 were arrested after they spoke with us. People have been arrested for talking to the media, and so it's a risk that a lot of people aren't willing to undertake, the risk of being arrested. So that means that also contributes to this lack of documentation or exposure of the human rights violations that are happening inside Ethiopia.
How can this climate of fear be broken? Is there any work that Amnesty International is doing in terms of, say, for example, engaging the UK government or the American government to pressure the Ethiopian government? Is there any progress in that front?
Well, we have been advocating on freedom of expression issues for many years, as have other organisations, including issues around the use of the anti-terror legislation, for example, to target journalists and political opposition party members, peaceful protesters, people who are openly expressing dissent or calling for reform or criticising the government. Those issues are at least understood now in the international community and by the donors to Ethiopia, the sort of countries that you mentioned. But there don't appear to be many opportunities for movement within that. One thing that we're trying to do on the back of this report, the Because I'm a Robo report, is that, as I said, violations are being perpetrated by the military, by the police, within the prison system, and these are systems that are receiving funding from foreign donors. So the first stage for those donors is that they need to exercise their own systems of accountability and oversight to ensure that their money isn't going directly to fund human rights violations and isn't going to the people who are perpetrating the violations. So the first stage for those donors is an obligation to investigate within their own aid structures and funding structures and assistance structures. So in the recommendations in this report, we're making recommendations to the Ethiopian government on many issues to address the violations that are documented there, but also to the donors to conduct their own investigations into the systems that they're funding. And then thirdly, because it is clearly demonstrable that domestic mechanisms within Ethiopia for investigation and accountability are not adequate in terms of impartiality, independence, access for victims. Therefore, the international human rights community has an obligation to intervene and to conduct investigations. So we're calling on the Human Rights Council of the UN and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to establish some sort of a mechanism that will conduct investigations into these allegations of widespread violations in Oromia as well as in other parts of the country.
did you get any responses from those organizations, the UN, the African Human Rights Commission?
We're going to be engaging with both institutions going forward and providing information to them on specifically on various areas of violations, including torture, arbitrary detention, some other issues, and we'll be trying to facilitate in any way that we can in terms of providing information and supporting whatever initiative might come out of that.